At 3:52 a.m. on February 9, 1944, Private Mateo Dela Cruz didn't reach for his M1 Garand. Instead, he crouched in the sulphurous rot of a Bougainville ravine, his cheeks puffed against a 3-foot length of hollowed bamboo. Ahead, 320 yards up the volcanic slope of Hill 700, the 6th Infantry Division of the Imperial Japanese Army held the high ground. They felt safe behind their Type 92 heavy machine guns and knee mortars. They had been taught that the Americans were loud, reliant on steel and supply lines. They hadn't been taught about the sump. Mateo held 5 hand-carved darts, each tipped with the lethal conotoxin of the textile cone snail, a poison that stops a human heart in seconds. To his CO, he was a primitive liability. To the soldiers on that ridge, he was about to become a ghost. In the next hour, this toy would achieve what a battalion-strength barrage could not, the total psychological collapse of a fortified position. But how did a discarded volunteer from Mindanao turn a vanished hunting craft into the ultimate force multiplier of modern war? Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The jungle doesn't just go quiet when a predator arrives. It changes its frequency. For the Japanese sentries on the northern ridgeline, the first sign of death wasn't a muzzle flash or the scent of cordite. It was a pocket of silence moving through the kunai grass like a hole in reality, a place where the usual chorus of insects simply stopped, then restarted in the wrong order. The Japanese infiltration techniques were legendary, but they had learned their jungle craft in the rubber plantations of Malaya and the forests of Burma. They had never navigated the volcanic dead zones of the Solomon Islands, where the cicadas went silent only for snakes, not for men. Mateo pressed his body deeper into the mud, his fingers finding the smooth bamboo tube at his side. His grandfather, a man who had fought the Spanish with a blade and the Americans with his wits, had called it a sump. Most GIs in the 164th Infantry Regiment thought it was a joke. A toy for hunting birds, not for breaking the back of an imperial offensive. The battalion intelligence officer in Brisbane had actually patted Mateo on the head when he first saw the weapon. "That's real cute, Private," Captain Morrison had said, his voice thick with condescension. "But we're fighting an industrial army, not rabbits in your village." 3 days ago, a Japanese mortar shell had turned Morrison into a memory. Now, with the ridge lost, the ammunition dumps targeted, and the Allied beachhead screaming for a retreat, Mateo knew something the academies at West Point and Tokyo had forgotten. Ancient weapons became ancient because they worked. They survived 10,000 years of human warfare because they solved problems that modern technology only overcomes through volume of fire. But when you have no ammunition, no radio, and no hope, ancient becomes modern real fast. The village of Baganga didn't measure time by the ticking of a clock, but by the shifting geometry of light through the canopy. Before Mateo Dela Cruz ever held a rifle, he held the wind. His grandfather, a man whose skin looked like scorched parchment and whose eyes had seen the Spanish flee and the Americans arrive, didn't teach him to shoot. He taught him to disappear. "The jungle is not a place you enter," the old man would whisper, his voice like dry leaves skittering over stone. "It is a conversation you join. If you speak too loudly, it stops talking. And when the jungle stops talking, you die." By the age of 9, Mateo was learning the mathematics of the sump. It wasn't just a hollowed piece of bambusa blue manna. It was an extension of the respiratory system. He spent months choosing the right stock, learning to fire-harden the wood until it was straight as a surveyor's line. He learned that the weight of the dart, a sliver of palm wood tipped with the pith of a sago tree, had to account for the humidity of the Mindanao morning. If the air was heavy with the coming monsoon, the puff of breath had to be sharper, a sudden violent release of the diaphragm that sent the needle-thin projectile whistling toward the throat of a fruit bat. But the weapon was only half the craft. The true secret lay in the geometry of the jungle, the ability to see the path through the vine choke before it existed. His grandfather taught him to track not by looking for footprints, but by reading the broken light. A bent fern leaf, a displaced pebble, or a bird that sang 2 notes too many, these were the fingerprints of an intruder. To Mateo, the jungle was a map of frequencies. The most dangerous lesson, however, took place on the reefs of the Philippine Sea. There, beneath the turquoise swells, lived the conus textile, the textile cone snail. To a casual observer, its shell was a work of art, covered in intricate brown and gold tints. To the elders of Mindanao, it was a vessel of concentrated death. Mateo learned the secret chemistry of the reef, how to provoke the snail into extending its proboscis, and how to harvest the milky conotoxin without letting a single drop touch his skin. He watched his grandfather apply the venom to the tips of the darts using a sliver of bone. It was a neurotoxin so potent it bypassed the body's defenses entirely, shutting down the sodium channels in the nervous system. A wild boar struck by a dart wouldn't scream, it would simply forget how to breathe. Its legs would fold, its heart would stutter, and it would return to the earth in a silence so profound it didn't even wake the insects on its back. This was the silent kill, a tradition refined over 10,000 years of tribal survival. By 1941, Mateo was the finest craftsman in the province, a ghost who could move through the densest thickets of Mindanao without snapping a twig. But as the shadow of the Imperial Japanese Army stretched across the Pacific, Mateo would soon find that his ancient toy was about to be tested against the industrial might of the 20th century. He had mastered the silence of the hunt, but he was entirely unprepared for the moment he would have to walk into an American recruitment office and convince a drunken sergeant that a piece of wood was deadlier than a machine gun. As the first Japanese bombs fell on Davao, Mateo realized that the jungle wasn't the only thing that could change its frequency. The world was about to scream, and he was the only one who knew how to stay quiet. The American war machine didn't see a hunter when Mateo de la Cruz stood in the recruitment line in Brisbane. It saw a deficit. To the harried officers of the 164th Infantry Regiment, Mateo was a collection of missing inches and absent pounds. By early 1943, the Pacific Theater was a meat grinder demanding bulk. Men who could shoulder 60-pound rucks and fire 8 rounds of .30-06 from an M1 Garand without flinching at the shoulder-bruising recoil. Mateo, with his slight frame and weathered skin, looked less like a soldier and more like a ghost that had wandered out of the hold of a refugee tramp steamer. "Name?" the clerk barked, not looking up from his paperwork. The air in the recruitment center was thick with the scent of unwashed wool and the metallic tang of floor wax. "Mateo de la Cruz," he replied, his English careful and clipped. "Experience. I know the jungle. I know how to move without being seen." The clerk finally looked up, eyeing Mateo's small hands. "We've got scouts for that, son. Usually boys from Montana who can track a deer. You ever fired a rifle?" Mateo thought of the sump wrapped in oilcloth among his meager belongings, a weapon that had taken more lives than the clerk had years. "I can hit what I aim at," he said simply. They processed him anyway, not because they valued his skill, but because the 164th needed warm bodies after the bloodletting on Guadalcanal. He was issued a serial number and a uniform 2 sizes too large, becoming a child of the wind, lost in a sea of olive drab. Training at Camp Lytton was a lesson in institutional arrogance. The American modernists worshipped the god of fire volume. During live-fire drills, Mateo struggled. The M1 Garand was a masterpiece of engineering, but in his hands, it was a clumsy, roaring beast. Every time he pulled the trigger, the recoil felt like a mule's kick to his jaw, and the ping of the ejecting clip was a dinner bell for any enemy within 50 yards. "Jesus de la Cruz?" Sergeant Miller roared, his face a shade of crimson that matched the Australian sunset. "You're flinching like a schoolgirl. If a Japanese Zero was bearing down on you, you'd probably try to hide under a leaf. Look at this. This is a rifle. This is how we win wars. With steel and lead, not by wishing the enemy away." The mockery reached its peak the day Miller found the bamboo tube during a footlocker inspection. He held the 3-foot length of Bambusa blue manna aloft like a piece of refuse. The barracks erupted in laughter. "What's this, private? Planning on starting a woodwind section? Or is this for hunting rabbits in your backyard?" Miller's lip curled in a sneer as he tapped the hollow wood against the metal bed frame. "This is the U.S. Army. We don't use toys. We use ordnance." Mateo stayed silent, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall. He couldn't explain that the toy had been refined over 10 millennia. He couldn't tell them that while their Garands jammed in the mud and their muzzle flashes gave away their positions, the bamboo stayed silent. But as the 164th prepared to ship out for the sulphurous hell of Bougainville, Mateo knew the Americans were missing one vital piece of the puzzle. They had the weapons, but they didn't have the venom, and the secret to obtaining it would require a midnight heist in the heart of Brisbane that could get him court-martialed before he ever saw a Japanese soldier. The Brisbane docks in late 1943 were a chaotic symphony of diesel smoke and clanking cranes, as the U.S. Army Services of Supply scrambled to feed the insatiable hunger of the Pacific Theater. While the men of the 164th spent their leave drinking warm beer in the city's pubs, Mateo de la Cruz sought a different kind of sanctuary. He found it along the rocky inlets of Moreton Bay, where the warm currents of the Coral Sea deposited the treasures of the Great Barrier Reef. He wasn't looking for gold or salvaged scrap. He was looking for the conus textile. The textile cone snail was a small predator, its shell patterned with the intricate cloth of gold triangles that gave it its name. To the casual beachcomber, it was a beautiful souvenir. To Matteo, it was a biological factory for the most sophisticated neurotoxin on the planet. He spent his nights hunched over a flickering kerosene lamp in a secluded corner of the docks, the smell of salt and wet timber thick in the air. His hands, which had been called clumsy by Sergeant Miller, moved with the precision of a diamond cutter. Extracting the venom was a dance with sudden death. Matteo used a sliver of scavenged surgical steel to gently provoke the snail, waiting for it to extend its red-tipped proboscis, a tiny harpoon-like tooth designed to paralyze fish instantly. The snail didn't just bite. It injected a cocktail of hundreds of different conotoxins. Some targeted the heart, others the lungs, and others the very electrical signals that allowed a brain to tell a muscle to move. Matteo worked with a focused intensity, capturing the milky, translucent droplets into a glass vial he had stolen from the regimental infirmary. He knew that even a microscopic scratch from a contaminated needle would mean a quiet, suffocating end before he could even call for help. Once the venom was harvested, he turned to the chemistry of the hunt. He mixed the conotoxin with a thick resin made from boiled tree sap and charcoal dust, creating a dark, tacky paste that would cling to the palmwood tips of his darts. This was a weapon that defied the laws of modern conflict. The Hague Convention of 1899 and the subsequent Geneva Protocol strictly forbade the use of poisoned weapons, labeling them as superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. The American military hierarchy would have viewed his vial not as a tool of war, but as evidence for a court-martial. But Matteo didn't care about the rules of men who sat in offices 10,000 miles away. He had seen the way the Japanese moved through the shadows of Mindanao, and he knew that the fair fight the Americans were training for didn't exist in the sulphurous jungles of the Solomons. As he carefully dipped each of his 6 remaining darts into the black sludge, he knew he was preparing more than just a hunting kit. He was creating a psychological nightmare. Each dart was now a delivery system for a death so silent and absolute that it would bypass the ears of the sentries and go straight for their souls. As the troop transport SS John Ericsson began to load its human cargo for the voyage toward the Solomon Islands, Matteo felt the weight of the vial hidden against his chest. He was carrying a secret that could save the 164th or destroy him before he ever fired a shot. He didn't know that within weeks, the toy he had perfected in the dark would be his only defense against a force that the American artillery couldn't even see. The departure was only hours away, but as he watched the Brisbane skyline fade into the mist, a chilling realization hit him. The Japanese weren't the only ones who knew how to hide in the jungle, and they were already waiting for them on a ridge that was destined to become a slaughterhouse. When the 164th Infantry Regiment waded ashore at Torquemada in early 1944, the Pacific War ceased to be a matter of maps and became a matter of mud. Bougainville was not just an island. It was a breathing, predatory organism of volcanic ash and tangled mangroves. The air was a soup of humidity and the stench of anaerobic decay, the rot that gave the island its name. By February, the American perimeter was a fragile semicircle of foxholes and razor wire, clinging to the coast while the interior belonged to a shadow. The traditional U.S. scouting methods, designed for the open plains of Europe or the rolling hills of training camps, failed almost instantly. The standard issue M1944 combat pack felt like an anchor in the waist-deep swamps, and the heavy leather boots of the GIs became breeding grounds for jungle rot within 48 hours. Lieutenant Barnes, a man who believed in the textbook above all else, sent out reconnaissance patrols armed with M1 carbines and topographic maps that were largely guesswork. They returned, if they returned at all, hollow-eyed and shaking. They spoke of ghosts who could move through the undergrowth without snapping a single fern, and of the Arisaka Type 99 rifles that spoke from the canopy before vanishing back into the emerald gloom. The realization settled over the 164th like a fever. The Japanese owned the night. While the Americans huddled behind their M1917A1 heavy machine guns, peering into the darkness through the limited FOV of their trench periscopes, the Imperial Japanese Army moved with the terrifying fluidity of the jungle itself. They utilized spider holes, camouflaged pits reinforced with coconut logs, that allowed them to appear behind American lines, strike, and disappear. The American reliance on supply lines and massed artillery was useless when the enemy was 10 feet away and invisible. Matteo watched from the edge of the perimeter, his eyes tracing the subtle shifts in the tree line that the others missed. He saw the way the hornbills nested low, a sign of movement in the upper canopy that the American officers dismissed as just birds. He saw the slight discoloration of the mud where a Japanese scout had crawled, a trail as obvious to him as a highway. To the men of his platoon, the jungle was a wall of noise and terror. To Mateo, it was a ledger of their imminent destruction. One evening, after a particularly brutal ambush that left 3 scouts dead in a ravine just 500 yards from the field hospital, the tension snapped. Sergeant Miller, his nerves frayed by the constant, unseen pressure, found Mateo sitting in the rain, meticulously cleaning his 3-foot bamboo tube with a piece of silk. "Still playing with your stick, Dela Cruz?" Miller spat, the rain dripping from the brim of his M1 helmet. "We're losing men to an army of phantoms and you're polishing a piece of firewood. If you want to be useful, grab a shovel and start digging more graves. Because tomorrow we're moving toward the northern ridge, and the Japs are waiting for us to make a mistake." Miller didn't see the flash of cold steel in Mateo's eyes. He didn't know that the mistake had already been made, and it wasn't by the man holding the bamboo. It was a mistake of arrogance that was about to lead the entire battalion into a kill zone where even the heaviest artillery would be silent. But as the order came down to advance toward the volcanic slopes of Hill 700, Mateo noticed something that made his blood run colder than the jungle rain. A single, discarded cigarette but near the command tent, its brand not American, but a charred remnant of a Japanese golden bat. The enemy wasn't just in the jungle anymore, they were already inside the wire. By the late afternoon of February 6, 1944, the humidity on Bougainville had become a physical weight, pressing the scent of diesel and dysentery into the very pores of the men. The 164th Infantry was on the verge of a nervous collapse. Every rustle in the kunai grass was a suspected Japanese infiltrator, and every shadow was a sniper. Sergeant Miller, his face a map of sleep deprivation and heat rash, found his breaking point near the rear echelon latrine pits. Mateo was there, sitting on an overturned crate, using a shard of volcanic glass to shave a fraction of a millimeter from the shaft of a palmwood dart. The 3-foot bamboo sump rested across his knees. To Mateo it was a lifeline. To Miller, it was a mocking reminder of their vulnerability. "I told you to get rid of that trash, Dela Cruz," Miller growled, his hand tightening on the sling of his M1 Garand. The sergeant's boots were caked in the gray, sulphurous mud of the volcanic island. "We're moving out for Hill 700 in 6 hours. I'm not having a man in my squad carrying a goddamn flute while the Japs are carrying Arisaka Type 99s. Mateo didn't look up. "It is not a flute, Sergeant. It is how I will keep your scouts alive." The calm in Mateo's voice was the final spark. Miller lunged, snatching the bamboo tube from Mateo's lap. With a roar of frustrated modernist rage, he slammed the Bambusa Blue Mana against the edge of a timber support post. The hollow wood shrieked as it splintered. The precise internal bore Mateo had spent weeks perfecting collapsing into useless shards. Miller didn't stop there. He tossed the broken remains into the black, fly-ridden sludge of the latrine pit. "Now you're a soldier," Miller spat, looming over him. "Pick up your rifle and find your gear. If I see you with another stick, I'll have you up for insubordination before the sun hits the canopy." Mateo watched the ripples in the filth subside. He didn't shout. He didn't swing. He possessed a silent resilience that Miller, for all his rank, could never comprehend. As the sergeant stomped away, Mateo simply stood, his weathered face as unreadable as the jungle itself. He knew that the Arisakas would bark tonight, and the American steel would be too slow to answer. When the moon rose over the volcanic peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the camp, Mateo moved. While the rest of the 164th tried to find a few hours of fitful sleep, he slipped past the perimeter wire and into the dense thicket of the ravine. He didn't need a supply line. The jungle was his armory. Using a K-bar knife scavenged from a fallen Marine, he selected a new stalk of bamboo, testing its weight and grain by touch alone. In the total darkness, he began the painstaking process of rebuilding. He used a heated wire to burn through the internal nodes, his lungs working like bellows to keep the embers glowing. He was a craftsman of Mindanao once more, reclaiming his heritage from the wreckage of American arrogance. But as the first light of February 7th began to bleed through the canopy, Mateo heard a sound that froze the breath in his chest, a rhythmic, metallic clicking coming from the high ground of Hill 700. It wasn't the sound of construction, it was the sound of a Type 92 heavy machine gun being test-fired, and the barrel wasn't pointed at the beach, it was pointed directly at the path the 164th was ordered to take in less than an hour. The sun rose like a bruised eye over the volcanic peaks of Bougainville on February 7, 1944. According to the tactical maps in the command tent, the northern ridgeline of Hill 700 was a contested zone. Military logic, refined at West Point and dictated by the industrial might of the United States, suggested that a sustained mortar barrage followed by a disciplined frontal assault would clear the heights. But the jungle of the Solomons did not follow the logic of the map-makers. As the 164th Infantry began their ascent, the neat, organized rows Sergeant Miller favored were instantly shredded. The air was suddenly torn apart by the rhythmic, mechanical thud of the Type 92 heavy machine gun. The GIs called it the woodpecker because of its distinctive, slow cadence firing sound, but there was nothing natural about the way it raked the volcanic slope. From the high ground, the Japanese had a god's-eye view of the American approach, their positions concealed within spider holes and reinforced bunkers that looked like nothing more than mounds of rotting vegetation. The American response was a wall of sound, the frantic ping of M1 Garands and the roar of M1919 Browning machine guns, but they were firing at ghosts. The geometry of the jungle that Mateo had warned about had been turned against them. By midday, the ridgeline wasn't just a contested zone, it was a slaughterhouse. The Japanese 6th Infantry Division had utilized the dead zones of the terrain to create a crossfire that effectively decapitated the American command structure on the slope. By the evening of February 8th, the 164th had been pushed back into the sulfurous ravines. The field hospitals near the beachhead were overflowing with men who had never even seen the soldier who shot them. In the flickering light of the command tent, Major Holloway stared at the casualty reports with a stinking despair. The logic had failed. The Japanese now held the high ground, giving them a direct line of fire onto the ammunition dumps and the precarious Allied landing zone. "It's over," Holloway whispered, his voice cracking. "If we don't retake that ridge by dawn, the Japanese will have enough time to bring up their Type 41 75mm mountain guns. They'll shell us back into the sea." He began drafting the evacuation order, his pen scratching harshly against the paper. The American war machine, with all its steel and fire volume, was preparing to admit defeat to an enemy that owned the dark. In the corner of the tent, unnoticed by the frantic officers, Mateo de la Cruz stood motionless. His rebuilt bamboo sump was gripped in a hand that didn't shake. He watched as Holloway's hand hovered over the authorized withdrawal stamp. Mateo knew that the logic of the modern world had reached its limit, but he also knew that the Japanese on the ridge had a weakness that no American officer had yet identified, a flaw in their own sense of invincibility that only a ghost could exploit. As the major reached for the ink pad, Mateo stepped out of the shadows and spoke the only words that could stop the retreat, words that would lead him into a solo authorization so crazy, it would either save the 164th or ensure he died a primitive failure in the mud of a foreign hell. The interior of the command tent smelled of wet canvas, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of fear. It was 23:15 on February 8, 1944. Outside, the tropical rain hammered against the fabric, a rhythmic drumming that masked the occasional terrifying crack thump of Japanese mortar fire landing closer to the perimeter. Colonel Robert Hall, CO of the 164th, sat hunched over a folding table, his eyes fixed on a topographic map of Hill 700. The red circles indicating Japanese machine gun nests had multiplied until the map looked like it was bleeding. "The 37th Division can't link up with us through the swamp," Hall muttered, his voice gravelly from days of shouting. "And we can't hold the beachhead if they bring those Type 41 75mm mountain guns onto the ridge. If we don't have that high ground by dawn, I'm ordering the withdrawal." "Sir," a voice came from the shadows near the tent flap. It was soft, almost drowned out by the rain, but it carried a strange, vibrating authority. Hall looked up, blinking against the dim light of the M1937 field lantern. Mateo de la Cruz stepped forward. He didn't salute. The formality felt hollow in the face of annihilation. In his hand he held the rebuilt bamboo sump, the wood dark and wet. "Private de la Cruz," Hall sighed. "I've heard about you. The man with the toy. Sergeant Miller wants you on a work detail digging latrines. Why aren't you there?" "Because the men who dig those latrines will be dead before they can use them, Colonel," Mateo said. He pointed a weathered finger at the map, specifically at a narrow vertical ravine the Americans had labeled inaccessible. "The Japanese feel safe there. They have their Type 92 heavy machine guns focused on the main trail. They expect a battalion of men and the noise of 1,000 shells. They do not expect a ghost." "A ghost?" Major Holloway scoffed from the corner. "You want to take that ridge with a blowgun?" "I do not want to take the ridge, Major. I want to kill the men who hold it, one by one, in the dark where they cannot see the muzzle flash. If the officers die and the guns go silent, the men will break. They are brave, but they are terrified of what they cannot name. The officers exchanged a look of weary disbelief. To them, war was a matter of logistics. Tons of steel moved against tons of flesh. Mateo's proposal was crazy, a suicide mission born of primitive delusion. But Hall looked at the casualty reports again. He looked at the 164th, a regiment of modern men who were currently being systematically dismantled by a jungle they didn't understand. The withdrawal starts at 4 o'clock, Hall said, his voice dropping to a whisper. That gives you exactly 4 hours. If the guns on Hill 700 are still firing at 4:01, we pull back to the beach and abandon the sector. You go alone. No radio, no support. If you're captured, we aren't coming for you. Mateo nodded, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. I was born in the dark, Colonel. I do not need a radio to speak to the jungle. As Mateo slipped out of the tent and vanished into the black curtain of the rain, he didn't head for the ammunition dump. He headed for the mud. He began to coat his skin in the volcanic ash and rotting leaf mold, erasing the scent of American soap and tobacco. He had 4 hours to achieve total annihilation, but as he reached the base of the inaccessible ravine, he realized he wasn't alone. A Japanese scout, hidden in a spider hole less than 20 yards away, had already sensed the shift in the wind, and the first dart was still tucked safely in Mateo's pouch. At 1:20 a.m. on February 9, 1944, Hill 700 was a fortress of invisible geometry. To the Japanese 6th Infantry Division, the volcanic slope was a series of interlocking fire zones, but to Mateo de la Cruz, it was a map of vulnerabilities. Coated in the stinking gray volcanic mud of Bougainville, he was no longer a man. He was a part of the island's respiratory system. He moved through the razor-sharp kunai grass not by pushing it aside, but by flowing through the gaps, a technique his grandfather had called walking between the raindrops. The first sentry sat near the mouth of a spider hole overlooking the southern ravine. He was cradling an Arisaka Type 99 rifle, his head nodding in the heavy, humid heat. Mateo didn't use his knife. From 15 feet away he raised the bamboo sump. With a sharp, silent puff from his diaphragm, the palmwood dart hissed through the air. It struck the sentry's neck, the conus textile venom entering the carotid artery instantly. The effect was terrifying in its absolute silence. There was no gasp, no struggle. The neurotoxin bypassed the brain's ability to signal the lungs. The soldier's eyes went wide, his fingers twitched once against the wooden stock of his rifle, and then his entire nervous system simply disconnected. He slumped forward into the mud, a dead man who looked like he was merely sleeping. Mateo moved past him, retrieving the dart to wipe it clean. He wasn't just killing, he was harvesting. He reached the first Type 92 heavy machine gun nest at 2:15 a.m. The woodpecker sat on its tripod, its strip-fed ammunition tray loaded and ready to mow down the 164th at dawn. Mateo didn't blow it up. Instead, he used a small, jagged rock to jam the feeding mechanism and carefully removed the firing pin with his K-bar knife, pocketing the small piece of steel. He left a single hand-carved dart resting on the gun's cooling fins, a signature of the ghost. By 3 a.m., the cascading panic began to take root. Mateo moved through the command bunkers like a shadow, targeting the officers first. He knew that an army without its head is just a collection of terrified individuals. He blew a dart into the shoulder of a captain reviewing maps, then another into a sergeant major leaning against a supply crate. As the bodies began to pile up, silent, bloodless, and unmarked, the remaining Japanese soldiers began to whisper. They found their leaders dead in chairs, their sentries cold in holes, and their legendary machine guns rendered into useless scrap metal by an enemy they could neither hear nor see. In the center of the command post, Mateo pinned a scrap of paper to the map table with a dart. It was the surrender note he had drafted in the dark, written in the rough Japanese he'd learned from traders in Davao. It didn't ask for terms, it simply stated that the jungle had claimed them. As 3:52 a.m. approached, the hour of the final hook, the ridge was no longer a fortified position. It was a tomb of psychological collapse. The Japanese soldiers, convinced they were being hunted by a WWII, a vengeful ghost, began to fire blindly into the dark, their discipline shattered by the absolute silence of Mateo's war. But as Mateo prepared to vanish back into the ravine to meet his deadline, he heard a sound that wasn't part of his plan. The low, guttural rumble of a Type 95 Hago light tank engine turning over in a hidden revetment just behind the ridge. He had dismantled the men, but he hadn't accounted for the steel beast that was about to roar to life, and the colonel's 4-hour window was seconds away from slamming shut. At 4:01 a.m. on February 9, 1944, Colonel Hall stood at the edge of the American perimeter, his thumb hovering over the signal for a full retreat. The silence from Hill 700 was absolute. There were no woodpeckers barking, no mortar thumps, only the distant rhythmic wash of the Pacific against the shore. Then a single green flare hissed into the damp sky from the summit, the signal that the impossible had been achieved. When the lead elements of the 164th Infantry finally crested the ridge at dawn, they didn't find a battlefield, they found a museum of terror. The morning light filtered through the canopy, illuminating a scene that would haunt the survivors for decades. Japanese soldiers were slumped in their foxholes, their skin a pale, waxy gray, with no visible wounds save for a tiny inflamed puncture no larger than a mosquito bite. The Type 92 heavy machine guns sat intact but paralyzed, their firing pins gone, each one tagged with a single bamboo dart. In the center of the command bunker, Major Holloway found the note pinned to the map table. The Japanese company had not been defeated by fire volume. They had been broken by the absence of sound. The few survivors they captured were found huddled together in a state of catatonic shock, babbling about the Kaze no Ko, the child of the wind, who had come to reclaim the island for the spirits. Mateo de la Cruz was nowhere to be found. He had already slipped back into the ranks, a discarded volunteer once again, his splintered bamboo stump hidden beneath a poncho. But the legend could not be suppressed. Within weeks, reports of the ghost of Mindanao reached the high command in Brisbane. The modernists who had mocked Mateo's toy were suddenly forced to reckon with a reality that defied their West Point textbooks. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, sent observers to interview the primitive private, realizing that Mateo had proven a fundamental truth. Ancient wisdom was the ultimate force multiplier in unconventional warfare. By the time the Bougainville campaign ended, the tactics Mateo had refined in the jungles of his youth were being quietly integrated into the training of elite jungle scouts. The geometry of the jungle and the chemistry of the textile cone snail became classified footnotes in the birth of modern special operations. Mateo himself refused any medals, returning to the Philippines after the war to the vanishing world his grandfather had protected. He left behind a legacy that ensured the modern world would never again look at a piece of bamboo and see only a toy. The American military machine had learned that in the dark, where technology fails and the jungle breathes, the deadliest weapon isn't the one that makes the most noise, it's the one that knows how to listen to the silence. Stories like Mateo's don't survive on their own. For decades, this history was buried under bureaucracy and overlooked because it didn't fit the modern narrative of war. If you leave this video without interacting, you're letting that silence win again. Don't let the ghost of Mindanao vanish back into the shadows. Hit the like button to tell the algorithm this history matters, and subscribe so we can keep dragging these forgotten legends into the light. If you respect the craft it took to survive that ridge, drop a respect in the comments.